It is crying time. I did better this week. We'll get into even more emotion next week. Now, just to set the stage, this night that Christ is going through began Thursday. It was beginning of Passover, and it's the Last Supper. The Passover dinner would have had to have occurred prior to sundown. So it's at that time when they have the lamb and all of that, and Jesus has the body or the bread and the blood at the Last Supper. And then they go over to the Garden of Gethsemane where he prays. And as he comes back from praying, he finds his disciples asleep, and he's speaking to them. And he is saying, you need to be praying. And it's right then that this gigantic mob comes up. And he looks at Judas, Jesus looks at Judas and says, would you betray the Son of Man with a kiss? The hypocrisy of kissing me is what he's saying. Would you betray the Son of Man with a kiss? And he looks at what was probably hundreds of people, including the Roman guard, the officers of the court, the Sanhedrin. And he said, did you come with swords and clubs as if I'm a robber? I was in the temple every single day, and you didn't do anything to lay a hand on me. And so he looks at him, he says, in the midst of this darkness, at this point in time, it's prior to 3 a.m., and he is up all night. And he looks at him and he says, but this is your hour, and he calls it the power of darkness. And they haul him to the high priest house, and I'll go through the trials. The high priest, there's two high priests at this time. Annas had been originally the high priest. He was removed, and his son-in-law was put in charge by the Romans. And they have a trial in his place. And it's at this point in time where Peter, denies Christ 3 times. And at one point, after he denies the 3rd time, somehow Jesus walks into a window and looks out. And the Greek word talks about how the look was intent and loving and with emotion. Jesus looks at him, it's crying time. And Peter is just crushed. He's just crushed because he remembers at the Last Supper, he remembers Jesus looking at him and saying, Simon, Simon, Satan demanded to have you so that he could sift you like wheat, so that he could shake you and shake the good out of you. But I have prayed to God that when you turn back to me, that you'll be able to prop up your brothers. And he remembers that, and he's just crushed. But in that hearing, they decide that Jesus has committed blasphemy. And so they take him to the Sanhedrin. The Sanhedrin, I'm going to go off on a side track launch. I'll do that several times. The Jews were known, in terms of an ancient society, the Jews were known for jurisprudence. They were about proper procedures. They had to have the right number of witnesses before someone was convicted. They were not about mob rule. They were about fair trials. They were about a proper process. That's when I refer to jurisprudence. That's what they were about. This night, they throw all that out the window and they go to mob rule. And so it's right then when they come before the Sanhedrin and they ask, are you the Christ? And he says, if I answered you, you wouldn't believe me. And if I asked you, you wouldn't answer me. But tonight, the Son of Man will go to be at the right hand of the Father. And they say, so are you the Son of God? They use all those terms, Christ, Son of Man, Son of God. And Luke is making a statement here that this is, yes, all of those. And he said, you say, which is an idiom like we would say, you know it, meaning ego amin, which we know, ame rather, which is I am. He's like confirmed, you know it, I am. And it's right then they say, what more do we need? And they haul him into his civil Roman Gentile trials. So let's go to slide 7. We've reworked this slide. Oh, by the way, I was towel snapped by some of the women. Whoever was at the women's lunch, they multiple people told Carolyn that I need to be distributing these charts and graphs because they're just up on the screen and I never send them out. So from now on, I don't want any trouble with women. We're going to send a PDF of the slides out with the lesson recording that comes out on Sunday or Monday. And so we'll be distributing this. This one has been reworked. Last week it was fuzzy and not good, but the first trial is with Annas. Again, he is the high priest that is revered by the Jews, and he is the first one to hear Jesus, and he is operating somewhat as a grand jury, deciding whether Jesus would continue in trial. And he says it's okay to be prosecuted. They take him to Caiaphas. Caiaphas concludes that he has committed blasphemy. That takes place, those two trials, which never should have happened. The high priests are not supposed to interrogate witnesses, according to the Mishnah. That takes place prior to 3 a.m. At somewhere between 5 a.m. and 6 a.m., which would have been daylight, the Sanhedrin would have been convened. And that's where they decide that he has committed blasphemy, that he has called himself the Son of God, and he'll be put to death. From there, well, first of all, the Jews had lost their right to capital punishment. And so they need to convince the Romans, that Jesus must be put to death. And so begins today the fourth, fifth, and sixth trials that are held by the Gentiles. I say civil, it's criminal, civil, Roman, Gentile trials. And there is a message that comes through these. Pilate is doing everything he can to say this person should not die. And Luke is making a special point to say this man Jesus did nothing. And it comes out again and again and again. He did nothing. And that is the message for us, that there was nothing that he did that was worthy of death, which is why he was a worthy sacrifice for our sins.
Then the whole company of them arose and brought him before Pilate, and they began to accuse him, saying, "We found this man misleading our nation and forbidding us to give tribute to Caesar, and saying that he himself is Christ, a king." And Pilate asked him, "Are you the king of the Jews?" And he answered him, "You have said so." Then Pilate said to the chief priests and the crowd, "I find no guilt in this man." But they were urgent, saying, "He stirs up the people, teaching throughout all Judea and Galilee, even to this place."
The whole company. Let's go to slide 9 again from last week. This is the Sanhedrin, which would have been camped in or placed in the temple court. And this comes from Numbers 11, where 70 people are appointed to help Moses rule. The 70 people stood in judgment, plus the high priest would have been 71 people. All of this company of people who are trying Jesus inside the temple court, when they decide to take him to Pilate, every one of them get up. And you're going to find out through every one of these trials, every one of these people are following, and they're getting more and more and more emotional, wanting Jesus to be put to death. And so let's go to slide 10. Pilate would have been the ruler of this area. He is called a governor. He is called a tetrarch or a precept. He was under Tiberius. He was appointed in 26 AD, and he served until 36 AD. Jesus is put to death in 33 AD. He's hated by the Jews. That's recorded by Josephus. And he had unique powers. So he had soldiers, but these soldiers were not soldiers to go to war. These were soldiers to keep the peace. He had the power to appoint the high priest. He had the power of capital punishment. He could put people to death. He had the power to mint money. He had the power to tax. He was a man of great power, and he was put in position to where he could have, of his own accord, since the Jews didn't have the ability to prosecute, he had the ability to acquit Jesus. This is his area of rule. You'll see that it does not include Galilee, but it does include Judea, which includes Jerusalem. Let's go back to the scriptures. So the whole company of them arose, and they're following to Pilate's. We'll look at the map in a second. Pilate is in one of two places. He's either in the Antonia fortress or he's in the Praetorium. We don't know where his headquarters were, but I'll show you that on a map. And they begin to accuse him, saying, then Luke alone records these accusations. We found this man, number one, to be misleading our nation. Number two, forbidding us to give tribute to Caesar. And number three, that he himself is Christ a king. Number one, misleading the nation. Did he mislead the nation? No, it's a lie. They were presuming that he was a false. Here's another thing. So the Romans didn't care whether he was a religious leader. They didn't care whether he was a religious Messiah. What they cared about was keeping the peace and making sure there wasn't an uprising against Caesar. That's all Pilate cares about. So these charges, every one of them, are to get him into a mode that it piques his interest and he decides to fix this problem because Jesus is the problem. So misleading the nation, meaning presumably to mislead the Jews away from Caesar, the king. Number two, forbidding to give tribute to Caesar. We already know that the Herodians have come to him and they said, Master, teacher, rabbi, is it lawful for us to pay tribute to Caesar? And remember what he said? Pull out a coin. Whose image is that? Render unto Caesar that which is Caesar's, and unto God that which is God's. So presumably, if there was something that God might claim that Caesar would also claim, then I guess you could say that it would be forbidding to give tribute. But this is, at best, a half-truth, and it's mostly a whole lie. And then saying he himself is Christ, a king. Did he say that? Guilty. This is the one that he actually did. And we'll talk about what Christ the king means. And Pilate asked him, Pilate only cares about this third charge. Pilate asked him, are you king of the Jews? The reason he asked this is because there was an exploding desire for the Messiah to come, for the Messiah to throw off the yoke of Rome. And so the Messiah, he knows, Pilate knows, that the Messiah is going to be the king that sits on the throne in Jerusalem. He is going to be our king in end times that sits on the throne in Jerusalem. And so he's like, are you the one? Are you the Mashiach? Are you the Messiah? And he answered him and said, you have said so. And again, this is not a good translation. What this means, it would be like us saying, you know it. You know this to be true. And Pilate does something weird in the book of Luke. He says, you know it. I am a king. I am a Messiah. And then Pilate goes to the chief priest and crowds and says, I find no guilt in this man. That's kind of an odd circumstance. You have to go to John 18. This is slide 11. So Pilate entered his headquarters again, and he called Jesus and said to him, are you king of the Jews? And Jesus answered, do you say this of your own accord, or did others say it to you about me? And Pilate answered, am I a Jew? Your own nation and the chief priests have delivered you over to me. What have you done? And Jesus answered, my kingdom is not of this world. If my kingdom were of this world, my servants would have been fighting that I might not be delivered over to the Jews. But my kingdom is not from the world. And Pilate said to him, so you are a king? Jesus says, you say that I am a king. Again, you know it. You say that I'm a king. For this purpose I was born. I was born to be the Messiah. For this purpose I was born, to bear witness to the truth. Everyone who is of the truth listens to my voice. And Pilate said, what is the truth? After he had said this, he went back outside to the Jews and told them, I find no guilt in him. Throughout this story, in Luke and in John, there is a Greek word that means nothing. And it's like 6 or 7 times Pilate says, I find nothing of guilt is what the Greek means. I find nothing, I find nothing, I find nothing. And that's what John just said. And so he turns around and he says, I find nothing guilt in this man, but this mob are urgent, and they grow more intense, and they say, he stirs up the people, teaching throughout all of Judea. Teaching is didasko. The Greek word didasko means to teach in order to conform, to turn somebody into a radical. That, like the Muslims, which I'll cover in a minute. The Muslims radicalize people. That's teaching throughout all of Judea, from Galilee even to this place. And they throw the term Galilee in because they want to pique Pilate's interest. Galilee is a hotbed of insurrection. And so they mention Galilee, and Pilate reacts in a way that they didn't anticipate. Pilate right now is doing everything he can. For some reason in this story, the there are Christian historians that believe that Pilate was actually saved after all of this. I don't know that that's true or that it's even relevant. But this is an example so far with a man that is struggling to do what is right, what he believes is right. It's not the questions that he asked, what is truth? He could have expediently taken care of this issue without emotion, but he's trying to do what is right. And it's a real story that should be applicable to us. We're going to be in situations where we are called or we are tested with doing something that is not healthy for Christ. And we're called as Christians to do what is righteous even when it's painful. And so Pilate is struggling with this, and he's a key part of this story.
When Pilate heard this, he asked whether the man was a Galilean. And when he learned that he belonged to Herod's jurisdiction, he sent him over to Herod, who was himself in Jerusalem at the time. And when Herod saw Jesus, he was very glad, for he had long desired to see him, because he had heard about him, and he was hoping to see some sign done by him. So he questioned him at some length, but he made no answer. The chief priests and the scribes stood by, vehemently accusing him. And Herod with his soldiers treated him with contempt and mocked him. Then, arraying him in splendid clothing, he sent him back to Pilate. And then Herod and Pilate became friends with each other that very day. For before this, they had been at enmity with each other.
When Pilate heard this, in verse 6, when he heard the word Galilee, that he's preaching in Galilee, Pilate is like, aha, I've got a way to wash my hands of this, because this was not Pilate's area. If he's from Galilee, then this is going to be Herod's area. Now, Pilate and Herod are both in Jerusalem right now, and neither one of them live there. Herod lived in Tiberias, which is in Galilee, which is where Jesus is from. Do you know the Bible never records Jesus having gone to Tiberias? That's where John the Baptist was put to death. Jesus never went there. And so Herod, even though he governed Galilee, heard all these things about Jesus, he had never seen him. He has traveled, and Pilate have traveled to Jerusalem, as we've talked about, because there's 2 million people that have come. There's all this messianic talk. And their job is to make sure that people keep the peace. So both of them are there. He is in Herod's castle, Herod's palace. And when they heard that he belonged to Herod's jurisdiction, he sent him over to Herod. So let's go to slide 13. So I showed you this map last week. The night begins in the Garden of Gethsemane on the far right. And it comes down south to number 1, Annas, and this is in the high priest's palace. Presumably, Annas and Caiaphas share the same house in different rooms. And so the first trial takes place with Annas, the second takes place with Caiaphas, and then they send him to the Sanhedrin, which operates in the temple. They have a hearing, and they decide, okay, this is blasphemy. He's calling himself God. They send him to one of two places. They send him to Pilate. Pilate was either in the fortress of Antonia or he was in the Praetorium, and we don't know where his headquarters were. So number 4 is Pilate. Number 5, they will send him down to Herod's palace. That's where Herod is. And then Herod will find no fault, and he'll mistreat him, and he'll send him back to Pilate for the final. Let's go to slide 14. So in terms of who this is, you've seen this before. This is about the 3rd time if we've studied Luke. Herod the Great was the great builder of Jerusalem. Herod the Great died in 4 BC. Herod the Great is the king that tried to put the babies to death to kill Jesus. He died in 4 BC, so you've heard me say that I believe Jesus was 36 to 37 years old. This trial takes place in 33 AD. Herod was alive when Jesus was born, so you get 36 to 37 AD. His son, Herod Antipas, is who is in play here. Herod Agrippa, the first and second, are in Acts, but this is Herod Antipas. Herod Antipas marries his niece, Herodias, who is right below him. Herodias had been married to her uncle, Philip, and Herod Antipas stole her away, and John the Baptist was highly critical of Herod Antipas. So let's go to Matthew 14. This is not on the screen. At that time, Herod the Tetrarch heard about the fame of Jesus, and he said to his servant, "This John the Baptist, he has been raised from the dead, but why these miraculous powers are at work in him? For Herod had seized John and bound him and put him in prison for the sake of Herodias, his brother Philip's wife, because John had been saying to him, 'It's not lawful for you to have her.' And he had wanted to put him to death. He feared the people because they held him to be a prophet. But when Herod's birthday came, the daughter of Herodias danced before the company, and it pleased Herod, so that he promised with an oath to give her whatever she might ask. Prompted by her mother, she said, 'Give me the head of John the Baptist here on a platter.' And the king was sorry because of his oath, and his guest he commanded it to be given. He sent and had John beheaded in the prison, and his head was brought out on a platter." So this is the Herod that has basically crucified John the Baptist. And so as Jesus is standing here before Herod, he knows this has gone on. Herod also was very glad. If we read Luke 9:7, also not on the slides. Now, Herod the Tetrarch, by the way, tetrarch means that he is ruler of a quarter. And he was the ruler of the white areas on the map. That's Galilee and Perea. He was a ruler of a quarter of the region. That would have included the Galilee. You see Tiberias up on the Sea of Galilee where Jesus never went, but where Jesus operated all around. Now, Herod the Tetrarch heard about all that was happening, and he was perplexed because it was said by some that John had been raised from the dead, and by some that Elijah had appeared, and by others that one of the prophets had risen. And Herod said, "John I beheaded, but who is this about whom I hear such things?" And he sought to see him. Herod Antipas is not looking to find a Messiah. He's not looking for a spiritual answer. He's looking for a magician at a carnival. And when he is seeking to see him, he wants to see some kind of miracle. And so let's go back to the scriptures. Verse 8, when Herod saw Jesus, he was very glad. And he was glad, for he had long desired to see him in Tiberias, because he had heard about him, and he was hoping to see some kind of sign. So he questioned him at some length, presumably about the signs, and Jesus won't answer. And the question is, you have somebody questioning you, and they're seeking something. This is Jesus' opportunity to witness to Herod, and he sits there and he's totally quiet. And the reason is because Herod wasn't looking for the answers. Herod's heart wasn't in a place where he cared, and Jesus' mission was to go to that cross. And so Jesus sat here and he didn't say a single word, and that was in fulfillment of prophecy on slide 15, Isaiah 53:7. He was oppressed and he was afflicted, yet he opened not his mouth. Like a lamb he was led to the slaughter, and like a sheep before its shearers is silent, and he opened not his mouth. And so this is part of the prophecy of us, pointing to us that this is the Messiah. This song you need to read, we've read it, but you need to read all of Isaiah 53 because it points to Jesus Christ as the Messiah. It's called the Song of the Suffering Servant. So let's go back to the scriptures. In verse 11, and Herod with his soldiers treated him with contempt and mocked him. By all the way through this, you get the tone of mocking and laughing and having a joyous time in doing this to Jesus. It's been said that you know a lot about someone based on what they laugh at and what they think is funny. And so this is pure evil that's going on. And the pure evil is actually the religious people. They are the ones, those that are supposed to be upholding what is right, those who have their God-ordained jurisprudence to run a process are pure evil. And so Herod treats him with contempt and mocks him and puts on this splendid array of clothing and sends him back. And this is possibly the same robe that after Pilate beats him, when he's really scourged. We talk about light beatings today, but when he's really scourged and the skin comes off his back and down into his muscle, and people have talked about his kidneys could have been exposed, when all of that's happening, they put a robe back on him, and such that he couldn't carry the cross. And so this may have been the same robe. And Herod and Pilate became friends with each other that very day. For before this, they had been at enmity. They had had friction. I work in the Middle East, as you know, a lot. And one of the sayings there is, the enemy of the enemy is my friend. And this is an example of two guys that respect each other for how they are mistreating the Messiah. And you see that in the Middle East, by the way. Hezbollah. Was that not awesome? So Hamas, on October 7th, Hamas flies in, takes hostages, kills innocent people, rapes women. I did a litany on that. Hamas is a Sunni organization, a branch of Muslims that are Sunni. They have nothing in common with Iranian Shia, but Iran funds Hamas. And the bombs that they used and the weapons that they use come directly from Iran. When that happened and Israel began to respond, Hezbollah started firing rockets into northern Israel from the north. Gaza Strip is where Hamas is. That's in the south. That's where the Philistines were. That's where Goliath was, in the Gaza Strip. Up north, you have Hezbollah, who Iran has basically funded Hezbollah in Lebanon, and they are total Shia. The Shia and the Sunni, they don't have any interest in each other whatsoever. The thing they have in common is they hate Israel. And I'll be honest with you, I'm a huge fan of Israel, but Israel is they're lost as a goose. They do not have Christ as a nation. And there are more and more and more people that are becoming Messianic Christians. But Israel has a huge place in the future times. It's there that Christ will come again. He will rule from Jerusalem in a millennial kingdom. But what they pulled off this week, I would have looked back and said one of the greatest military victories of all time was, I don't even know if it's true, but the Trojan horse that's awesome. And then I would have said the killing of the Hamas leader in Tehran in an Iranian hotel, that was awesome. That's like 1 and 2. Until this week, where 6,000 radios, pagers, walkie-talkies blow up in the ears of terrorists, and they are terrorists. That's amazing, and they can't communicate. They're like scrambling around wondering, can I open my washing machine? Can I turn on my TV? can somebody get me a carrier pigeon so I can send a, and all of a sudden they come meet together, and Israel hits him again and kills a general. And I am conflicted as a Christian because there's a part of me that's glad they're in hell, but I'm glad they're gone. Let me just say that I hope they found Jesus the day before they died, but I'm glad they're gone. And that is a classic, sorry for that rant, but that is a classic example of the friend of, my enemy is the, excuse me, the enemy is my friend. All right, I've got to get out of that one, so let's.
Pilate then called together the chief priests and the rulers and the people, and said to them, "You brought me this man as one who was misleading the people. And after examining him before you, behold, I did not find this man guilty of any of your charges against him, neither did Herod, for he sent him back to us, Look, nothing deserving death has been done by him. I will therefore punish and release him." But they all cried out together, "Away with this man, and release to us Barabbas, a man who had been thrown into prison for an insurrection started in the city and for murder." Pilate addressed them once more, desiring to release Jesus. But they kept shouting, "Crucify, crucify him." A third time he said to them, "Why? What evil has he done? I have found no guilt deserving death. I will therefore punish and release him." But they were urgent, demanding with loud cries that he should be crucified, and their voices prevailed. So Pilate decided that their demand should be granted. He released the man who had been thrown into prison for insurrection and murder, for whom they asked, but he delivered Jesus over to their will.
Again, you see this, hundreds of people are following him. You saw the map where they're moving, and these people are following him every step of the way because they've got one mission, and it is to shout down any proper process. And Pilate says, "You brought me this man as one who was misleading the people, and after examining him, I find nothing of guilt." Nothing, again in Greek, nothing, any of your charges against him. Neither did Herod. Herod, one of the things I didn't talk about, Herod is a Semite. That is a cousin of the Jews. Esau and Jacob were twin brothers, and Esau sold his birthright. Esau's name became Edom, and he became the head of the Edomites. The Edomites end up being called the Idumeans, and Herod the Great was an Idumean, and he understood the Jewish religion. He is the one that built the gigantic temple that invested in it to placate the people. And so he had some regard for the Jewish faith, and so Pilate is saying, look, I'm a Roman. I can't find anything wrong, but this man's cousin, Herod Antipas, is a Semite, and he can't find anything wrong either, and he sent him back. So nothing deserving of death has been done. And so now, one of the things that had happened with Pilate, let's go to slide 17. While Pilate is sitting on the judgment seat, his wife sent word to him, "Have nothing to do with that righteous man," being Jesus, "for I have suffered much because of him today in a dream." So Pilate, he's got several things going on. He knows what is right, and he's got a woman problem. And I know what that's like. And so his woman is saying, don't do anything with this man. And so everything, all of his motivations to do what's right, to keep his wife happy, is to let Jesus off, not to everything. But he decides to compromise. And he decides, therefore, I will punish him and release him. And punishment is not the scourge. The punishment, this is a light beating, which is not good. An innocent man should be released. An innocent man shouldn't go through a light beating. An innocent man shouldn't be dragged through 6 different trials through high priests that aren't supposed to question him. They're not supposed to be beaten by people of the court. They're not supposed to be beaten by government officials. This was not supposed to happen. Luke 23:17, you'll see, is gone, and Jeff has added an emoji. So in the King James Version, you see this verse, for of necessity he must release one unto them at the feast. So the King James Version was written in the 1600s, prior to the time that we had all of the manuscripts that we have today. The most reliable and oldest manuscripts didn't have this verse. So what happened as the King James Version was being written, and later actually, scribes added this parenthetical note, and they pulled it probably from Mark 15:6. Now it was Pilate's custom at the feast to release to the people a prisoner of their choosing, and the scribe is just adding this so that the reader will have context, but it's not part of the scripture. So let's go back. Verse 18, but they all cried out together, away with this man, and release to us Barabbas. Does anybody know what bar, B-A-R, means in Hebrew? Son of. Anybody knows what Abbas means? Father. Origen, who is a historian, says that his name was actually Jesus Barabbas, which would have been Jesus, son of Father. And this is a wonderful illustration most people just pass over. When he's saying Jesus Barabbas, son of the Father, it's a story of substitutionary atonement. This is a story of an insurrectionist and a murderer that was released, and Christ was put to death in his place. And he is the son of a human father, whereas Jesus was the son of God. Jesus, the son of God, stood in his place and took the death, and Barabbas was released. And it's just a perfect illustration of what is a true biblical truth, that Jesus stood in our place. So as we look at Barabbas, we might as well just look at ourselves. Matthew 27 says that he was a notorious criminal. And in verse 21, they keep shouting. They're actually yelling, crucify him, crucify him. And the word in Greek is from crucify is cross. The root word is cross, and it's nail him to the cross. They're yelling, nail him to the cross, nail him to the cross. And they're yelling louder and louder. And Pilate is like, why? What evil has he done? I have found nothing of guilt. I have found nothing. Therefore, third attempt, I'm going to punish him and release him. But they become more demanding and more urgent, and their voices prevailed. And so Pilate decided that their demand should be granted. John MacArthur, I disagree with him on certain things, but he is a giant in terms of a modern day commentator, preacher. I can walk you through things I disagree with, but in his commentary, John MacArthur says the entire series of trials was filled with irony. The one whom men judged is going to be the judge of all men. The one whom men condemned will eternally condemn them. The perfectly righteous, sinless, innocent one was condemned as a blasphemer and a criminal. The one who always pleased holy God did not please sinful men. Men sought to kill the very one who gave them life. The Lord Jesus Christ was declared a blasphemer for claiming to be who he truly is and making his accusers blasphemers. This trial, Jesus did nothing. When we talk about jurisprudence, there should be an act. He was killed for who he was, not for what he did. There's nothing that he did that was breaking any law whatsoever, and that is the travesty. Now, Acts 2:23 is the important context. This Jesus delivered up according to the definite plan and the foreknowledge of God, you crucified and killed by the hands of lawless men. And the whole point is that this travesty that went on is part of a plan. It was foreordained for us. And that's the beauty of this story. It's such a gift to us. And you just have to hold on to that. All right. Crying time again. Comments? Thoughts? All right. Thank you all.
Thank you, Russell. I'm sitting back there just thinking about all that mob early on in the lesson, that mob mentality, and how often we personally are probably involved in conversations that draw us. I mean, it's kind of, you kind of get that snowball effect going, and you got to separate yourself from those things. So thank you, Russ. Okay, well, hope everybody has a great week. I'm going to ask Greg if he would close us out in our dismissal prayer. Have a good week, guys.